All right, good morning, everyone. Looks like the attendance is starting to slow down now, so we might as well get started. Welcome. We're very happy to have you here today at our CEQA 202 webinar series on greenhouse gas emissions. We hope that we'll have a very informative and helpful presentation for you today, but before we begin, we're very fortunate to have California Air Resources Board member Gideon Krakoff here with us to give us a short introduction and kick us off. So without further ado, I'll let him take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Oh my gosh, 600 plus people here. What a turnout. My name is Gideon Krakoff. I'm the governor's appointee as a board member to the California Air Resources Board. I want to thank you, Shannon Clark, and the whole OPR team, Jen Gress, Annalisa Pedro from the Air Resources Board. And on behalf of our chair, Leanne Randolph, and the board, we really appreciate this joint presentation, workshop today, and coordination from the Office of Planning and Research and CARB. The IPCC's recently released sixth assessment report confirms that we're already seeing the consequences of more than 1 degree Celsius of global warming, extreme weather, rising sea levels, and reduced sea ice. Immediate and massive cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, are necessary to meet the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. And California is rising to the challenge of climate change. CARB's 2022 Scoping Plan Update, I hope most of you know what that is, released last December, makes clear that local governments are key partners in California's effort to achieve carbon neutrality. Local actions consistent with the Scoping Plan help create the necessary conditions for our state policies to succeed. And as the Scoping Plan indicates, I think it's Appendix D, CEQA is an important tool to promote alignment between local decision-making and the state's climate goals. Local actions should support the state-level air quality and GHG mitigation goals. Now, both Chair Randolph and I come from a municipal law background, and that background and that perspective, I think, is one of the reasons why we're selected to serve on the Air Resources Board. And I happen to practice CEQA law and believe that all parties, all stakeholders, want to see CEQA's greenhouse gas analysis advance our state climate goals in a way that provides certainty, a way that is effective, especially in a way that is practicable, understandable for the agencies. And we know this is not always easy in this area of law and policy. For example, as many of you know, there's a line of published CEQA cases out of San Diego County that show that it can be hard to do it right. Or where I'm from, North LA County, Newhall, the Tahoe projects. So the goal for today is to help provide consistency and clarity among lead agencies, project sponsors, practitioners, consultants, and the general public about how to do CEQA analysis for greenhouse gas impacts to ensure that discretionary projects throughout the state advance our climate goals. We at CARB, as regulators, policymakers, believe that it's imperative that CEQA analysis reflect the benefits of projects that will help the state reduce its dependence on automobiles and fossil fuels and promote infill housing, transit, and active transportation infrastructure, as well as clean energy generation. Similarly, projects that contribute to worsening the climate crisis should be required to mitigate their impacts. And we all know CEQA is designed to be an effective tool to that end. Again, I especially commend staff at OPR and CARB for working together to provide practicable clarity. That's the phrase of the day, about best practices for evaluating and mitigating CEQA GHG impacts consistent with the state's goals. And I commend all of you, almost 700 of you, wow, for attending and helping to elevate the quality of GHG analysis under CEQA. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Board Member Krakoff. And I'm very excited to get us started today. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I'm also fortunate that I get to introduce our very talented speaker panel that we have here today. My name is Shannon Clark. I am Land Use Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I am joined today by my colleague, Austin Kerr, who's our Air Quality and GHG Analyst at OPR, Shannon Hatcher, who's our Air Pollution Specialist at the California Air Resources Board, Jeannie Lee, who's Assistant Chief Counsel at CARB, Nick Rabinowitz, who's Senior Staff Attorney at CARB, and Abby Young, who's the Climate Protection Manager at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Next slide. So just a few notes about the webinar before we begin. We will be using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, to take questions. Feel free to input questions at any time during the presentation, and we will save some time at the end to answer questions. There will be a few poll slides throughout the presentation that Zoom participants will be able to participate and vote in what they think the answer would be, and hopefully that'll enable you to participate and engage with the content we'll be talking about a little bit more. And finally, unless it's required by law, the points discussed today are just recommended best practices for GHG analyses under CEQA and aren't mandatory. Next slide. Oh, and finally, this is just a plug for our CEQA 202 series, of which this is a part of. The CEQA 202 series provide a more detailed explanation of foundational CEQA concepts. So if you have any questions or you hear a few CEQA terms that you're not familiar with throughout this presentation, I really invite you to check out our webpage, our Getting Started webpage that's linked on the screen. To check out our prior CEQA 202 webinars, as well as the other CEQA resources that we have available to the public there. Next slide. So getting into today's presentation. So our presentation is broken up into kind of the three main steps for high-level steps for doing a GHG analysis under CEQA. First, identifying and assessing the project's GHG emissions. Second, determining the significance of those emissions. And third, if needed, avoiding or mitigating any project impacts. Next slide. And here we are in our first segment on identifying and assessing emissions. Evaluating your emission sources. So a project under CEQA is defined to include the whole of an action which has the potential for resulting in either a direct physical change in the environment or a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change on the environment. And that comes directly from the CEQA guidelines. So keeping that definition in mind, in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, there are a number of types of emission sources that might be applicable to a particular project. Generally, you'll see that in GHG emissions analyses, though not always, you'll see them broken up by construction versus operational emissions. So that's sort of how we've outlined some of these emission sources here. And these are just examples of types of emission sources that a project might have. This is by no means an exclusive list. So for construction emissions, these would be the emissions that actually are generated, of course, by construction activity at the site. They include construction equipment that may generate greenhouse gas emissions if it's powered by gasoline, for example, at the site, trucks hauling materials to and from the site, worker commute trips. And then on the other side, we have operational emissions. And this is, of course, the emissions that would be generated through the operation of the project. This includes vehicle trips, for example, those induced by a project for residents that go to and from the site or to other activities. It includes natural gas and electricity consumption on site, water consumption and the generation of wastewater, solid waste disposal, and landscape maintenance activity, among many other things. Next slide. And we want you to consider the lifetime of the project in analyzing your emissions sources. So when we say lifetime of a project, what we're referring to, or what other people are referring to, is the time frame in which the GHGs would be emitted for your project. So if you've calculated all of your operational emission sources, for example, the lifetime would be for how long that project is likely to be continuing to emit those emissions. So CEQA guidelines don't provide a whole lot of guidance on the lifetime of a project, but they do specify that a GHG analysis must give due consideration to both the short-term and the long-term effects of the project. But ultimately, lead agencies have a lot of discretion in terms of determining the lifetime. The appropriate time frame will be pretty fact dependent, will depend on the type of project that you're working on, and should be always supported by substantial evidence. Next slide. And finally, you'll need to establish an appropriate methodology for analyzing your GHG emissions. The CEQA guidelines state that the analysis must demonstrate a good faith effort based on the extent possible from scientific and factual data to describe, calculate, or estimate the amount of GHG emissions from a project. And more specifically, the model or methodology should, as I said before, be supported by substantial evidence and should explain the limitations of the methodology selected. To get a little bit deeper into this issue, I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie Lee with our first poll question.
Next slide. Ryan, can you go to, thanks. Good morning, everybody. So it's time for our first poll question. True or false? Under CEQA, a project is required to quantify its greenhouse gas emissions. So you should have a screen that has popped up on your side. We'll give you a few seconds here to answer. There should also be a radio button. Okay, great. I'm going to end this poll here. Ryan, do you want to do the big reveal and share the results of our first poll question? Okay, so 67% of you said true, or 33% said false. So the answer is false. Under CEQA guidelines section 15064.4, lead agencies can analyze greenhouse gas emissions using either a quantitative or a qualitative approach. So under either approach, the lead agency must make a good faith effort to disclose the amount and significance of a project's emissions based to the extent possible on scientific and factual data. The 2016 case of Mission Bay Alliance provides a helpful example here. This case involved a CEQA challenge to the EIR for a redevelopment plan area, which, among other uses, included construction of the Golden State Warriors arena. In that case, the city and county of San Francisco had adopted a greenhouse gas strategy. The strategy itself quantified the baseline greenhouse gas emissions and included reduction measures. There, the EIR analyzed the emissions under a qualitative approach, and it relied on the energy and conservation standards in the strategy to conclude that the greenhouse gas emissions would not have a significant effect. In that case, the court upheld this approach and concluded the impact analysis was supported by substantial evidence. So that's the end of poll question number 1. I'll turn it back over to the next speaker.
Okay, now that we've identified and assessed greenhouse gas emissions from a project, how do we determine their significance under CEQA? Next slide, please. First, let's talk about the environmental setting and baseline conditions. The environmental setting, it typically describes the environmental conditions in the project study area under baseline conditions. Section 15.125 of the CEQA guidelines provides guidance for establishing baseline conditions, which typically reflect conditions at the time that the notice of preparation or NOP is published or when the environmental analysis begins. However, there may be circumstances where the date of the NOP's publication may not accurately reflect the true baseline from which to assess the impact of a project. An example of this is the CEQA analysis beginning several years after publication of the NOP. Another example is using actual or historic volumes rather than permitted volumes that were never achieved in practice, such as in the CBE versus South Coast Air Quality Management Court decision from 2010. While baseline typically is when the NOP or environmental analysis begins, sometimes a future baseline can be considered in certain analyses. Future baselines may be used if an existing baseline is misleading or without informational value, and should only apply to situations that are justified by unusual aspects of the project or the surrounding conditions. Folks can look to the Neighbors Court decision from 2013 for more on this point. Finally, it's important to consider both the local and regional perspective when setting the baseline. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about project level versus cumulative greenhouse gas impacts. First, it should be noted that climate change is inherently a cumulative issue, as the individual project emissions will most likely not have any appreciable impact on the global climate problem by themselves. To put this another way, the emissions from one single project will not cause climate change to occur across the planet. However, the emissions from that single project, they do contribute to the significant cumulative impact caused by greenhouse gas emissions from other sources across the globe. Therefore, the question becomes whether the project's incremental addition of greenhouse gases is cumulatively considerable in light of the global climate problem and is therefore significant. This is held in the Cleveland decision from 2017 that folks can look to for additional information. Next slide, please. When preparing the greenhouse gas impact analysis, CEQA guidelines section 15064 and relevant portions of Appendix G of the CEQA guidelines recommends that lead agency consider a project's consistency with relevant adopted plans and discuss any inconsistencies with applicable regional plans, including plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Further, Appendix G of the state CEQA guidelines, it provides two questions that assist lead agencies when assessing the significance of a project's greenhouse gas emissions. These questions ask whether a project would result in a potentially significant impact related to climate change, and whether a project would conflict with relevant plans, policies, or regulations adopted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When preparing a CEQA greenhouse gas impact analysis, analysts should ensure that they're addressing both of these questions. And I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Austin, I think, is our next presenter, and I think you might be muted, Austin.
Oh, here I am. Thanks. Sorry. I am going to talk about thresholds of significance and in the various types. On this slide, we present the official definition of a threshold, and I want to illustrate this. I want to first mention that projects have the potential to result in impacts to the environment, and we use the threshold to determine whether an impact would be significant, and if so, thereby requiring mitigation. So if I can, I'd like to really spell this out in an example in the context of noise. Imagine if a truck distribution center is located near a residential area, and the local community in its general plan and its noise element has a noise exposure standard of 60 decibels for residential areas. And it's computed that the truck activity would exceed that exposure level. In this case, the threshold is 60 decibels, and the exceedance of that threshold would result in a significant noise impact, and mitigation would be required. Again, going with the noise example, an earthen berm or sound wall would need to be perhaps be constructed along the property line to reduce the noise exposure level back down to a level less than 60 decibels. So this is a very straightforward example of kind of how a threshold is applied and how it informs mitigation. Thresholds for evaluating greenhouse gas emissions, however, are not nearly as straightforward. And They can be either quantitative or qualitative. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think for now on this slide, I want to point out that a lead agency can apply more than one threshold in its GHG analysis. And we acknowledge, doing so is really a best practice. For instance, an impact analysis may quantify a project's emissions to compare to an established numerical threshold, but also include a qualitative assessment of whether the project would be consistent with the scoping plan or a local climate action plan. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some different types of thresholds, and they're listed here. These are generally presented in a kind of historical order. During the early days of CEQA, after AB 32 was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006, mass emission thresholds were commonly used, and then some different types were developed by air districts and lead agencies throughout the state. And I'll go over each of these type of thresholds and explain some of the considerations and best practices we recommend lead agencies use when developing these types of thresholds and applying them in analyses. Next slide, please. So mass emission thresholds, a really common metric for these is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. They come with an ease of use. If they're not exceeded, then the impact is less than significant. If they are exceeded, then the impact is determined to be significant. And the reduction that mitigation needs to achieve can be clearly calculated. Let's say, for instance, in the early days of after AB 32 was passed in 2006, a mass emission threshold of 10,000 metric tons annually was commonly used. So if you imagine a project applying that threshold and it calculates that its emissions would be 12,000 metric tons, we know exactly that it needs to reduce by 2,000 metric tons with mitigation to reduce that threshold to a less than significant level. So it's a very straightforward, offers a very straightforward approach. There's some challenges with this types of threshold, so it's being used less and less. One is we recommend that if a lead agency is applying a mass emission threshold that it established or is established by another entity, perhaps an air district, we recommended that checking on whether the threshold is aligned with a statewide target and whether there's evidence to support that alignment. Another kind of challenge of mass emission thresholds is they overlook the greenhouse gas efficiency of a project. Small projects that are greenhouse gas inefficient can end up being considered less than significant, where larger projects that are greenhouse gas efficient can end up essentially being penalized for being too large. If you considered, say, a development that consists of 12 single-family homes in an exurban area with each home on a 20-acre lot, that's not really a greenhouse gas efficient situation necessarily. If you compared that to, say, a 400-unit multifamily residential project in a downtown area with access to lots of, in a walkable area with access to lots of services and close to mass transit, that could be would likely be a very greenhouse gas efficient project. It's the type of project that will help achieve our climate goals as a state. But it could really be sort of penalized because it's large when using a mass emission threshold to evaluate it. So this brings me to the next slide, efficiency thresholds. Some common metrics are metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per resident annually, or per employee annually, or per service population annually, where service population is the number of residents supported by the project plus the number of employees or jobs supported by the project. And it's a good way to compare. The service population based metric offers a good way to compare different planning scenarios. For example, back in 2010, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District developed a threshold that was service population based. It was 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per service population unit annually. And while they never officially adopted the threshold, they went through the work of putting it together with substantial evidence, and many lead agencies in their jurisdiction used that threshold for a number of years to analyze land use development projects. The advantage with efficiency thresholds is they take into account a project's utility or the benefit or whatever it offers to the community or region. That might be housing or serving as a job center or doing both. Another advantage is they don't penalize greenhouse gas efficient projects for being large. So if you go back to I mentioned before, the large 400 unit multifamily development in the downtown area, it's applying this type of threshold, the results, doesn't gives favor to good GHG efficient planning, and maybe even promotes more of it to occur. There are some challenges with efficiency thresholds, however. It can be difficult to develop or apply an efficiency threshold to some types of land uses, such as retail stores or schools or city parks or state parks. And it takes some work to show that they're aligned with statewide GHG targets or science-based targets. And so our recommendation is, if applying an efficiency-based threshold, review which statewide target it's aligned with. Make sure it's aligned with a future target, not the 2020 target that has since passed. And also, the threshold needs to be based on substantial evidence. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, there's a poll question. Jeannie?
Thanks, Austin. All right, so it's time for our next poll. The question is, can a lead agency ever use statewide data to support an efficiency threshold used for assessing project level impacts? So please focus on the second question here. I know that all three questions are popping up, but just focus on the second one. We'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, so we're going to end the poll. 87% of you said yes, 13% of you said no. So Ryan, thank you for the big reveal there. So the answer is yes, an agency can use statewide data. There's a big but here, but when assessing project level impacts, a lead agency who relies on an efficiency metric derived from statewide data should support with substantial evidence showing how that metric appropriately applies to the project level analysis. So the 2016 Golden Door versus County of San Diego case is illustrative here. The County of San Diego had recommended an efficiency metric in its climate change analysis guidance document. There, the court found that the efficiency metric was not supported by substantial evidence. In that case, the efficiency metric relied on statewide service population and greenhouse gas inventory data. The court found that there was not substantial evidence showing why the statewide data was appropriate for setting the metric for the county. The required emissions reductions for a new land use project may not be the same as for the entire state population and economy, according to the court, because more reductions may be needed from land use projects than from the economy as a whole. So that's poll number 2. On to the next speaker.
It's still me. I'm going to be talking about a few slides about net zero thresholds, or really the net zero threshold. It's a specific type of mass emission threshold. The basic approach is calculating a project's projected emissions and subtracting out or netting out any emissions the project would replace. And if that value is equal to 0 or less than 0, then it would be considered less than significant when applying a net zero threshold. The metric is essentially 0 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. And this threshold has been used a lot in EIRs in the recent years. And that's why I'm going to talk about it more. Next slide, please. Some examples of how projects that might consider using this type of threshold. The first is a high-rise residential building being developed on the site of an existing surface parking lot. Another example is a 6-unit apartment building that is old and being demolished and replaced by a larger 24-unit apartment building. And the third example is a retail strip mall being replaced by an office park. We recommend, before doing this netting out, we recommend lead agencies make some important considerations. Go to the next slide, please. As a best practice, we recommend only netting out emissions associated with existing land use or existing activity if there's substantial evidence that those emissions would cease to continue as a result of the project. So, for example, I mentioned on the previous slide a high-rise residential building being developed on a surface parking lot. In this example, if the project site is in a downtown area where parking is scarce and that is well served by public transit, then it's probably reasonable to determine that the vehicle trips to and from the existing parking lot would cease as a result of the project. If, however, the residential development is going to be built in an area where there's currently a lot of unused parking, a lot of additional capacity for parking. In this case, it would be more likely that people driving to the area would simply park at another location nearby, and those associated emissions would not be replaced as a result of the project. Another example I want to mention is a new office park replacing a truck distribution center. So this is kind of an interesting scenario. I think an important question for lead agencies to ask is, would the GHG emitting truck trips to and from the distribution center cease as a result of the project? Or is it more likely they'd be replaced by truck trips to and from other distribution centers that are also serving the same region? So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that there can be a lot of gray area in when thinking about, when it's reasonable to net out the emissions associated with an existing land use. And I think that the takeaway I really want to leave you from this slide is, only net out emissions when there's substantial evidence that those emissions would cease to continue as a result of the project. Next slide. In some cases, netting out is very straightforward. So, for instance, if the new project is the same land use type as the land use it would replace, like, for instance, a larger residential building replacing a smaller one. This is generally straightforward because of the same land use type and they're providing the same benefit to the community in which they're located. Other examples can be less straightforward, like a new grocery store replacing a small apartment building. This might depend on whether it's the only grocery store serving the community in the area or whether there's other grocery stores nearby. Those are some considerations that might be good to think about. Another example that comes to mind is if a hotel resort project were developed on an area used for grazing cattle. I think it'd be wise to ask whether there's substantial evidence that those cattle would cease to exist as a result of the new hotel, or would they more likely be moved to graze somewhere else. So, just as a side note here, I think a lot of these examples reflect the reality that the maximum economic value of already developed parcels in urbanized areas changes over time in response to population growth and changes in the local or regional economy. And this is what some planners refer to as the natural evolution or progression of towns and cities. Next slide, please. This slide is really about the concept of operational life in the context of applying a net zero threshold. Shannon Clark talked about operational life on one of the early slides in this presentation. And we don't have a lot of recommendations to offer regarding what operational life to use. It really should be thought about on a case-by-case basis, and most importantly, whatever is used should be supported by evidence. But I want to mention, when providing a net zero approach, it's recommended that lead agencies don't just think about the operational life of the new land use, but also think about the remaining operational life of the existing land use that would be replaced. So consider whether an existing land use would be replaced because it's old or outdated, or the demand for it is falling, or it might even be the end of its capacity or the end of its operational life. So for instance, if a project would replace a 60-year-old strip mall, and the lead agency would want to net out the emissions associated with the continued operation of the strip mall, it's recommended they assess whether the strip mall would really continue to operate for as long as the new project. Another example, just food for thought here, consider the expansion of a gravel mine. Let's say it's currently, it's been operating for 20 years on 80 acres, and it has about 3 to 5 years of remaining capacity. And the proposed project is to expand the mine by 40 acres so it can operate another 15 years and continue to supply gravel to the region. In this example, it would only be reasonable to net out the emissions associated with the remaining 3 to 5 years of operations of the existing mine. There's a similar situation for landfill expansion projects, or really any sort of project type that has a pretty well-defined end to its operational life and isn't something that might operate in perpetuity. Let's go to the next slide. I also want to talk about a zero threshold, which isn't the same thing as a net zero threshold. It's very straightforward. There's no netting out of emissions associated with any activities on the parcel. The threshold is essentially the project emissions in and of themselves amount to zero or some value less than zero. It's really analyzing the project for what it is rather than anything it might be replacing. And for that reason, applying this kind of approach is more clearly aligned with CARB scoping plan, because a project that results in no additional emissions and yet is providing a benefit is a net positive in both ways. A project that achieves this threshold would likely incorporate a lot of on-site GHG reduction measures, including on-site renewable generation of electricity. Maybe it would be designed to be zero net energy. It would do all that it can to reduce emissions on-site, and for the remaining emissions, it would likely include a commitment to purchasing and retiring carbon credits to offset any remaining emissions. So I'll conclude my segment here with this slide. One of the takeaways we really want to leave here is it's recommended that analyses address both CEQA checklist questions. Lead agencies should consider that it's possible for a project to be near net zero or even result in net reduction in GHG emissions, but still conflict with the scoping plan to achieve statewide GHG targets or conflict with a local climate action plan. Thus, lead agencies may find it helpful to use more than one threshold of significance in their GHG analysis, such as one numeric threshold and another qualitative threshold that qualitatively analyzes whether the project would be consistent with state or local plans. This brings me to my segue for Nick to talk about how to analyze, qualitatively analyze, and I'll invoke the wording of the key checklist question, whether a project would conflict with an applicable plan, policy, or regulation adopted for the purpose of reducing GHGs. Next slide. Ryan, are you able
Folks
to
having
advance the slide?
technical issues. Austin, I believe this one was yours. I'm not sure if we want to advance to 29.
I think we want to be on slide 29 now.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. And apologies, I appear to be having camera issues. Not sure why, but I'll go ahead and jump in. So another pathway projects can take in evaluating significance is considering the extent to which the proposed project is consistent with regulations or requirements adopted to implement a statewide, regional, or local plan for greenhouse gas reduction. The Mission Bay Alliance case confirmed the viability of this significance approach, recognizing that a lead agency can properly use consistency with an applicable and adequate greenhouse gas reduction plan for determining that a project's greenhouse gas impacts are less than significant. A related significance consideration is asking whether, more generally, a project is consistent with state climate goals, including those set forth in the scoping plan. Multiple courts have recognized this significance approach, provided the agency's selection of the relevant climate goal is supported by substantial evidence. For example, in 2015, CBD versus Department of Fish and Wildlife held that consistency of state climate goals can properly be used as a significance criterion, provided it is adequately supported with substantial evidence. In 2017, the Sandag Court held that significance must be determined in step with evolving scientific knowledge and state regulatory schemes, which also supports this approach. Other courts have also affirmed that consistency with greenhouse gas planning goals is relevant to CEQA significance. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look at one of the court decisions mentioned on the last slide. The CBD versus CDFW decision, also known as the Newhall case, serves as both a cautionary tale and a path forward. The court in that case did not take issue with using consistency with AB 32, which contains the state's overarching climate goals, as a significance threshold. However, it did find that the lead agency in that case did not substantiate its selected significance threshold. For the project in that case, the agency attempted to directly apply a statewide and economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction figure as a greenhouse gas significance threshold. But the agency did not explain why reducing that particular project's emissions by that same economy-wide percentage was consistent with the state's climate goals. The court thus found the agency's decision to use that threshold was not supported by substantial evidence. The court held that the agency needed to bridge the analytical gap, as it put it, between statewide goal and project-specific greenhouse gas reductions, explaining why it was adequate to apply a statewide greenhouse gas reduction goal to a new land use development project. And I'll note that showing consistency with applicable greenhouse gas goals and plans has become somewhat easier over time. For example, with CARB presenting some potential options for considering greenhouse gas significance in its most recent scoping plan, which was adopted back in December of 2022. Other pathways are, of course, possible for evaluating significance as well, provided that the agency supports them with substantial evidence. And I'll pass on the next slide to Shannon Hatcher.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the guidance from CARB's scoping plan. Our scoping plan makes clear that local government efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within their jurisdiction are critical to achieving the state's air quality and climate goals. As Gideon had noted earlier, this is because local climate actions or local actions consistent with the scoping plan help to create the necessary conditions for state policies to succeed. To help our local partners identify reduction measures consistent with the state's climate goals, the scoping plan identifies 3 priority areas. These areas are VMT reduction, transportation electrification, and building decarbonization. They're designated as priority because they are the greenhouse gas reduction opportunities over which local governments have the most authority, as well as having the highest potential for meaningful greenhouse gas reductions. Consistent with these 3 priority areas, the scoping plan identifies a series of key project attributes, which are shown by empirical research to reduce the operational greenhouse gas emissions, as well as accommodating growth from residential and mixed-use development projects in a manner that's consistent with the climate and equity goals of SB 32. Residential and mixed-use projects can evaluate significance under CEQA by qualitatively determining whether they align with the scoping plan's key project attributes. On this slide, you can see the scoping plan's key project attributes for the VMT reduction priority area. As seen in this slide, the attributes associated with the VMT reduction priority area includes development of transit supportive infill sites with reduced parking requirements that conserve natural working lands, as well as affordable housing components that address equity. Next slide, please. This next slide shows the scoping plan's key priority attributes for the transportation electrification and the building decarbonization priority areas. As seen in this slide, the attributes associated with the transportation electrification priority area includes the inclusion of EV charging infrastructure that goes above and beyond the Cal Green Code, while the attributes for the building decarbonization priority area includes the installation of all electric appliances without any natural gas connections and no fossil fuels for water heating, space heating, and indoor cooking. As seen from these last two slides, the scoping plan envisions decarbonized transportation and housing that's inclusive, GHG efficient, and located in transportation efficient neighborhoods. And these would be clearly aligned with the state climate goals for CEQA purposes. So in general, residential and mixed use development projects that incorporate all of these key project attributes listed in the scoping plan are aligned with the state's priority GHG reduction strategies and are considered consistent with the scoping plan under CEQA. I can now turn it over to Jeannie with our next poll question.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, so we have our last poll question here. The question is, it relates to thresholds of significance. When setting thresholds, are lead agencies required to use statewide emissions reductions goals, such as the governor's executive order, which states a goal of achieving 80% below 1990 levels by 2050? Yes or no? And we'll give you a few more seconds to answer this question as well. Okay, so let's end the poll. So 92% of you said yes, 8% said no. So Ryan, can you do the big reveal? So the answer here is no. This question relates to the 2017 Cleveland National Forest Foundation versus Sandag case. In that case, it challenged the adequacy of the agency's EIR prepared for a regional transportation plan under CEQA. While the EIR compared the plan's greenhouse gas emissions impacts against statutory goals for 2020 and 2035, the agency did not compare the plan's impacts against the governor's executive order establishing a 2050 emissions reduction target. In that case, the court upheld the agency's decision not to use the executive order's 2050 goal as a threshold of significance. There, the court found that the agency's EIR adequately informed the public about the plan's greenhouse gas impacts and the plan's potential inconsistency with statewide climate change goals based on the information available at that time. However, the court was careful to say that what the county did here will not necessarily be sufficient moving forward. And as Nick mentioned earlier, CEQA requires agencies to ensure that their greenhouse gas analyses stay in step with evolving scientific knowledge and state regulatory schemes. And that ends our last poll. On to the next speaker.
Great, thank you. I think I'm unmuted. I'm sure you'll let me know if I'm not. So I'm Abby Young with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and I'm going to speak over the course of the next couple of slides on local climate action plans. And I know many of you participants are very familiar with local climate action plans, but for those of you that aren't, what are they? Many speakers have alluded to them, and what is their purpose? So like general plans, climate action plans are long-term planning documents. They're planning documents that create a vision for the community. But unlike general plans, that vision is not limited to how the community will grow. It also looks at the existing built infrastructure of the community, and it addresses how that existing part of the community should change to achieve the long-term vision. And in this case, that vision is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So most, I think all local climate action plans that I've seen have aligned with statewide greenhouse gas reduction targets. They cover all sectors. And they, again, focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But more and more recently, they also address related issues like adapting to climate change, building resilience in the face of local impacts from climate change, finding synergies between public health and both the impacts of climate change and the solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how those overlap. More and more often, as with many planning documents, we're also seeing a discussion of equity and how that issue interlaces. Next slide, please. So climate action plans and CEQA, we've heard these terms from a couple of speakers so far. You know, what is the relationship? Well, it's not really a perfect fit, and that's largely because, again, climate action plans are not just limited to new growth and new construction like CEQA is, but it's also, and in fact, the bulk of a local climate action plan is really looking at how do we change the existing built infrastructure and the built community to make it, you know, lower carbon, or in, you know, hopefully today's case, carbon neutral over time. There is, thank you to OPR, some statewide guidance on that allows future development projects under CEQA to streamline off of the environmental analysis that is done for a climate action plan. So if there is a future project that incorporates all of the relevant measures from an existing climate action plan, it could forego the environmental review for greenhouse gas emissions. But there sometimes are climate action plans that are better than others, right? So how important is it that that climate action plan is a strong plan that maximizes the odds that it really will achieve its own targets? And it's the strength of the plan that really supports the ability of future projects to be able to take advantage of that CEQA streamlining. Now, OPR has laid out some criteria for local climate action plans, or local, I think it's called strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, if a local climate action plan incorporates all this criteria, then it could be in a position to support future tiering of future development projects. But that guidance is very high level. You know, include an emissions inventory that covers all sectors with a forecast, have measures, have a target, but it really doesn't get at what needs to be in that plan. So what the Air District did was we developed guidance that's now posted on our website that provides a complementary suggestions and guidance to what OPR has provided in the statewide CEQA guidance. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And this is just a very, you know, very much a summary, but some of the key things that the Air District included in our guidance for creating a local climate action plan that is more likely to achieve its goals. We want to see that it's aligned. I think must is probably a severe word because you don't have to align with the state's targets, but it is a lot harder for a local government to devote the resources into developing its own target based on substantial evidence. So we have the state's carbon neutrality target, which was built on substantial evidence. So aligning with that carbon neutrality target is what we're looking for in a climate action plan. We also want to see a preponderance of mandatory versus voluntary measures. the more, the more teeth that a climate action plan has, the better its odds for achieving its own targets, and the better position, the more defensible position it will be in to support that future tiering of projects under CEQA. But what numbers does preponderance mean, right? So what we're really looking at is use mandatory measures as much as you can wherever it's appropriate. For example, when discussing new development, it's pretty appropriate to talk about mandatory measures, mandatory requirements on new development. It's a little tougher when you're talking about, existing homes having to switch out fossil fuel equipment for electric. That it's a little harder to make a mandatory requirement there. And it may be more appropriate to use voluntary measures, incentive-based measures, for example. We want to see climate action plans address the biggest emission sources, of course, rather than being, spreading peanut butter and doing a little bit on everything. We're seeing more and more that it's quality over quantity. What role do offsets play? Probably some, but you're safer if you minimize your reliance on offsets. Transparency becomes very, very important. If the public doesn't understand or can't tell why you're assuming that you're going to upgrade half of your existing building stock over the course of 3 years, then you're less likely to get their trust and buy-in. And then finally, when you're talking about a long-term target like carbon neutrality, implementation and monitoring strategies become the critical component. How is this plan being implemented over time? Is it on track? Is it doing the job that you thought it would do? If not, the monitoring, you need to go back, tinker, change, add. And so those components become very critical. Next slide, please. And as we were going through this exercise of developing this guidance, some questions came up, which we spoiler alert, have absolutely no answer to, but they're very interesting. There's been a lot of discussion, and I think there will be a lot more discussion. One of them is, well, should we even be bothering with some of these smaller sources and just focus our energies on buildings and transportation? Maybe. And then again, what role should or could offsets play? There's a lot to unpack there. And we may get at that with some future slides, but the role of offsets in plans is a topic that we're discussing. What about moving beyond quantification? If we know the ultimate target is carbon neutrality, and we know that we just have to get fossil fuels out of all our buildings, how much number crunching do we really need to involve in that process? Or should we take the resources we've been spending on the number crunching and invest them on adopting the policies and getting those in place that are going to get us to carbon neutrality? Now, some cities welcome that discussion, and others say, no, we kind of like our numbers. We understand them. We've trained our elected officials, they understand them, and changing now would be problematic. So it's a very interesting conversation that we're starting to have. So with that, I'll hand it on to the next speaker.
Okay, now that we've discussed assessing project emissions and determining significance, let's now turn our attention to mitigating and avoiding significant GHG impacts. CEQA requires that feasible mitigation be identified and adopted to lessen the significance of adverse effects on the environment. Avoidance and minimization measures incorporated as part of the project design and included in the project description, such as an environmental commitment, are not considered mitigation measures per section 15370 of the CEQA guidelines, as they're considered part of the CEQA project. Rather, these avoidance and minimization measures implemented as design features as part of the CEQA project must be identified, and their effectiveness of reducing or avoiding a potential impact must be described. Finally, when multiple measures are available to mitigate an impact, each measure should be discussed and a justification given for the measures that are ultimately selected. Next slide, please. When looking to mitigate impacts from a project, Analysts can look to subdivision C from section 15126.4 of the CEQA guidelines, which identifies measures that may be included to mitigate GHG emissions. These measures from 15126.4 are included on this slide, and I won't go through each one individually, but I wanted to specifically call out number 2, which identifies project design and energy efficiency features, and number 3, which identifies offsite measures, including offsets, and they're highlighted in bold here on the slide. I'll be discussing both of these a little bit more thoroughly in a bit. Next slide, please. This slide here presents the remaining measures from 15126.4 of the CEQA guidelines that may be used to mitigate GHG emissions. Next slide, please. I just mentioned project design features, offsite measures, and offsets on the previous slides. Analysts may wonder if there's any guidance for when each should be used for GHG mitigation. There is, and it's found in the scoping plan, which provides clarification of CEQA greenhouse gas mitigation and carbon offset credits by presenting a mitigation hierarchy. And this hierarchy is shown here on the slide. As part of the hierarchy, lead agencies should first prioritize on-site design features that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is seen in the first level on this slide. After all on-site greenhouse gas emission mitigation measures have been implemented, the next priority is to move to the second level, which is to seek off-site greenhouse gas mitigation. Off-site greenhouse gas mitigation is generally defined as either an investment of funds in an off-site greenhouse gas reduction project or directly implementing that off-site greenhouse gas reduction project. When considering off-site mitigation, lead agencies should first consider local off-site greenhouse gas reduction opportunities, followed by non-local opportunities once all feasible local opportunities are exhausted. Once all local and non-local off-site mitigation has been exhausted, voluntary carbon offset credits from a recognized and reputable registry on the carbon market should then be pursued. And this is seen on the last level of this slide. Offsets should be pursued as close to the project site as possible in the following order of priority. First, offsets originating in the same air basin as the project should be considered. Next, offsets elsewhere in California should be considered. And finally, offsets outside of California should be considered as a last resort. I'll now turn it over to Shannon Clark for additional guidance on CEQA mitigation.
All right. So there are a few other general requirements for all mitigation measures under CEQA that we'll talk about, and then we'll go into how they specifically apply to one particular type of GHG mitigation carbon offsets. So mitigation measures under CEQA must be fully enforceable through permit conditions, agreements, or other legally binding instruments. Additionally, the formulation of those mitigation measures shouldn't be deferred until some future time. The only reason it should be deferred is if it is impracticable or infeasible to include the specific details of a mitigation measure until after project approval. If that does happen, there are a few things that the agency must do. First, it must commit itself to the mitigation measure. It must adopt specific performance standards that the mitigation will achieve. And 3, it must identify the types of potential actions that can feasibly achieve that performance standard and that will be considered, analyzed, and potentially incorporated into the mitigation measure. And really what these both go to is this idea that, as the courts have said, mitigating conditions are not mere expressions of hope. CEQA really wants to make sure that mitigation measures that are incorporated under CEQA are really going to achieve the reductions or achieve what they set out to do. Next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about enforceability of mitigation measures as it applies to carbon offsets. And Shannon Hatcher, the other Shannon, talked a little bit about carbon offsets earlier, but carbon offset broadly refers to a reduction in GHG emissions or an increase in carbon storage, which could be something like planting trees that would take carbon from the atmosphere. that would be used to compensate for emissions that occur elsewhere. In the context of CEQA mitigation, those would be to compensate for the emissions from your project. The CEQA guidelines do contemplate the use of offsets. They specify that mitigation to reduce GHGs may include offsets that are, quote, not otherwise required. And what that really gets at is that if you're going to use offsets to mitigate your GHGs, the CEQA guidelines want to make sure that that reduction in GHGs wouldn't have already been required by a state law or a regulation, and that the reduction is occurring or just to mitigate the emissions of your project. However, because the use of carbon offsets, the use of carbon offsets can cause and impose challenges on agencies in ensuring their enforceability, because the reduction of the GHG emissions will occur elsewhere. This is partly why, as Shannon talked about earlier, we do recommend that you pursue more on-site reductions first, because those are a little bit more easier to enforce before you start pursuing mitigation options that are more off-site, like carbon offsets. But there is one big case that addresses carbon offsets and enforceability, and that is the Golden Door Properties v. County of San Diego case. Not to be confused with the Golden Door v. County of San Diego case that Jeannie talked about earlier in a poll question. That one's from 2018. This one's from 2020. And in this case, the county's mitigation measure, which utilized carbon offsets, in particular, its use of carbon offsets in the measure, was challenged. And in defense of the measure, the county argued, among other things, that the carbon offset measure was enforceable because it met the standards for offsets used in the state's cap and trade program. In response, the court decided to use the county's approach of taking the standards imposed on cap and trade, specifically the standards that offsets be real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, enforceable, and additional, and decided to use them as a metric for evaluating whether the county's measure was enforceable under CEQA. However, the court actually came to the opposite conclusion of the county and found that based on that metric, based on those standards, that San Diego's mitigation measure was not enforceable under CEQA. So the takeaways from this case are a bit limited in nature because the court decided to frame its analysis of enforceability as a response to the county's argument, which makes it pretty fact-specific in nature. However, I think there are some useful, helpful takeaways that agencies can pull from this case when considering using offsets as a mitigation measure under CEQA. First, and it is important to note that the requirements and standards that apply to cap and trade program, the cap and trade program, do not apply to voluntary offsets or the types of offsets that you would be using to mitigate a CEQA impact. However, because the court found that whether an offset measure is real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, enforceable, and additional as concepts to be a useful metric for evaluating enforceability, it may be a useful practice for agencies to undertake when evaluating their own carbon offset measures to evaluate their measure under those standards as well, but not required. So additionally, the court specifically expressed concerns with measures that used out-of-country offsets, or basically offsets where the GHG rejection activity was taking place internationally. The court felt that because it was international, it would be much more difficult to ensure the enforceability of those offsets. And so that might be something that lead agencies might want to reconsider using international offsets when using them, or maybe scrutinize those offsets a little bit more closely, set some more performance standards to really ensure their enforceability. Additionally, the court was concerned with the fact that the measure in question did not specifically require that the offsets be additional. And additionality is going back to this idea that, we don't want the offsets that you're using to have basically those reductions to have already been required by state law and would have happened anyway. And so the fact that the measure did not specifically set that as a requirement was a concern. And so that might be something that lead agencies want to consider when developing their own mitigation measures using offsets. And with that, I'll go to the next slide. All right, so we are here. We have about 15 minutes for questions. One thing I will flag is please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We already have a few queued up, so that's great. And additionally, if you would like a copy of the slides, please go ahead and email the email on the screen. You don't need to include it on the Q&A. So let's go through our questions here. So for our first question, so on operational emissions, wouldn't a project that generates petroleum products be considered a source of operational emissions? So I am not the technical expert, but my gut instinct is that the generation of petroleum products, both the actual generation of the process, as well as the, different aspects of the project could all have GHG implications. But I am just a lawyer, so I'm going to ask maybe one of our technical folks who might want to weigh in on that. Austin, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll chime in with a couple of thoughts. I don't necessarily have a definitive answer. The good news is that type of facility is an entity subject to the cap and trade program. I'll say that. But also, generally with CEQA analyses, we look at the emissions that, in that case, the refinery is actually emitting, and not necessarily the downstream emissions of the petroleum products they're developing. It'll be interesting. That's been the state of the practice, I'll say. I don't really have more to offer on that, but maybe somebody from CARB does.
Thanks, Austin. If there are no other thoughts on that one, I can move on to another question. This is talking about, will you discuss how truck trips fit into the emissions analysis and how that interacts with the exclusion of truck trips from the SB 743 guidelines? So I'm not really sure what you're referring to on the latter part of that conversation, of that question. To be clear, the SB 743 guidelines refer to the calculation of VMT, which is actually a separate impact from your greenhouse gas analyses. And truck trips would be a part of your overall VMT, but that's kind of a separate issue. But discussing how truck trips fit into your emissions analysis, I may turn it back to Austin if you want to talk a little bit about how truck trips might fit into an overall emissions analysis.
I'm again not sure if I have a definitive answer, but when analyzing a land use development project in general, whether it's industrial or commercial or residential, it's important to account for the emissions associated with vehicle trips to and from the project site, whether they be passenger vehicles or trucks, heavy trucks carrying cargo, and that partly comes out of the understanding that the amount of vehicle activity associated with land uses is very much a function of the land use development pattern. So if the project site is far from everything else, its trips will be longer and its VMT will be higher and the emissions will be higher. It's really an attempt to just make sure mobile source emissions are accounted for in CEQA analyses.
Okay, thank you. So I think our next question I'm going to direct toward Shannon Hatcher. And this question is, how does affordable housing reduce GHG emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we included affordable housing as one of the attributes in the scoping plan, we were working within the context of what SB 32 says that we need to consider when we're developing our climate targets. And so when considering our climate goals, we needed to address equity issues as well. And so that's one of the ways that we incorporated equity considerations as part of our project attribute list. And in addition, as we're trying to address the climate crisis, we're also trying to, at the same time, address the housing crisis. So we want to ensure that the housing crisis is being addressed in a way that's beneficial to the climate. And so we want to make sure that we're not, addressing one and exacerbating the other.
Thank you, Shannon. So our next question, I think I will be able to take. So this question says, technically speaking, any project could be considered cumulative if we're thinking from a bigger perspective, i.e. more development, more emissions, even if not at significant levels. How thorough should we go when we're analyzing GHGs? So I actually would point you back to, I think it's slide number 7, which talks about the definition of what a project is under CEQA. And that definition is also at CEQA guidelines, section 15378, subdivision A. And that definition says that the project under CEQA is defined to include the whole of an action which has the potential for resulting in either a direct physical change to the environment or a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change in the environment. And so I think you would want to make sure that in any emissions that you're discussing or the cumulative impacts of those, that they're really tied back to whether there's a direct physical change in the environment or there's the potential for a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change. Our next question, I think, is for Abby, and that is, so can offset credits be used to mitigate significant GHG impacts identified under the new qualitative threshold? If so, how would you suggest calculating the offset credits needed?
That's a pretty simple question. No, they can't. Because these are qualitative thresholds, there is no quantitative limit under which you could offset. And this is by design. Our analysis looked at achieving carbon neutrality by 2045 and found that new development has to have these different design elements. Continuing to extend the natural infrastructure infrastructure is not consistent with achieving carbon neutrality. Once it's extended, it really can't be taken back. And so continuing to put in natural gas piping into buildings is, we've determined, is inconsistent with carbon neutrality. Same thing for not aggressively beginning to reduce VMT and for not aggressively accelerating the transition to EVs. So those, and we have a justification report that lays out our analysis. So there's really no space for offsetting under our project level qualitative thresholds.
Thank you, Abby. So next question. And so for this question, I think I have a lawyer answer, and then I might turn it over to Austin for a more technical perspective on this question. So our next question is, so service population for efficiency goals is well and good for residential, commercial, and mixed use, but how does such a per capita metric work with industrial land uses and developments? And so my initial thought when hearing this is that part of the reason that lead agencies are given so much discretion under CEQA to determine what thresholds of significance might work best for them is that every threshold may not be appropriate or work best with every project. And so long as you're supporting your use of a particular threshold with substantial evidence, I think it's fine for agencies to use their discretion to pick the threshold that works best. Austin, what can you tell us? So
Yeah.
the question again.
I'll just add that the question is a really good one, and it really highlights that there isn't a one size fits all efficiency threshold that can be used for all types of land uses. It's difficult to, when the denominator in your efficiency metric is residents or jobs, and you're a land use that doesn't provide a lot of either, it generally doesn't, it's not a good fit of a threshold. And it's the same with like state parks, where a lot of people come and visit and sometimes make long trips, but there aren't a lot of people working there and there's nobody living there. And it's the same with schools, city parks, other recreational facilities, grocery stores, a lot of shoppers, a lot of GHG emitting activity if people are driving to and from the stores. And it's also true of industrial sources. So, if I'll just a side note, if the project is industrial and also an entity that's subject to the cap and trade program, I think that part of the story would be a good idea to include in the EIR and just in the thinking about its significance.
Thank you, Austin. And I actually think we have some more questions directed to you specifically regarding net zero. So there's a couple scenarios that I think are posed by a couple of different questions that might be helpful for us to flesh out. So the first question is, if a new school replaced a surface parking area and an outdated retail shopping center, could net zero emissions occur?
Let me talk about the outdated shopping center, or did it say outdated or out of business?
Outdated.
Okay.
We actually, I'll let you answer maybe at the same time. We actually have a follow-up question that asks, what if the existing use has been out of business for a few years? So I'll let you take it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, is that use generating emissions? Is it harboring activity that generates emissions? Are there trips to and from the use? Is there activity taking place on site? The existing condition is, generally speaking, and Shannon and other attorneys may chime in here, the condition at the time that the NOP was released. And if that condition is an old land use that is no longer operating or generating emissions, then there's no emissions to consider netting out. And I feel like I maybe missed another part of the question.
You want me to reread it? I'll go for it. If a new school replaced a surface parking area and an outdated retail shopping center, could net zero emissions occur?
Yeah, outdated. It may be out of style or outdated. It just comes down to whether or not people are still going there to shop, and whether their trips there generate emissions and there's activity going on site that generates emissions. It's a very pertinent question, because I think a lot of brick and mortar retail is declining in some places as big box stores take over, or as more shopping happens online. A lot of communities are probably experiencing situations like that. Hope my answer is somewhat helpful.
Thanks, Austin. So I think we have time for maybe one more quick question. So can you please specify if GHG good faith is only for an EIR or for an initial study or exempt findings? So I think this question is referring back to the slide on establishing an appropriate methodology. And just as a reminder, the CEQA guidelines, specifically section 15064.4, specify that an GHG analysis must make a good faith effort based on the extent possible from scientific and factual data to describe, calculate, or estimate the amount of GHG emissions from a project. So the good faith is of this guidelines is referring to how the method and methodology and how the agency chooses to calculate emissions. So that could be relevant in an EIR. It could also be relevant in initial study. I'm not thinking of a lot of places where that might be necessary for a specific exemption, but really it's where your lead agency is approaching a GHG analysis or calculation. So did anyone else have anything else to add to that question, maybe from a more technical perspective? Okay, with that, I think we can conclude here, but thank you all so much for joining us here today. And I think we all hope that this was helpful for you. And if you would like a copy of the slides, please go ahead and email the email that's on your screen right now. So thank you so very much. Bye-bye.